Hawaii, a first-time visitor to Hawaii. So we were comparing Houston, Texas, and Hawaii. And where they're both humid climates. I guess Houston lacks hills there, and Hawaii lacks oil. Anyway, but both have wisdom now that you're here and then going back there. I'm delighted on behalf of the program in Buddhist Studies at the University of Hawaii, and also the Hawaii Committee for Humanities, who generously really underwritten this whole series, and on behalf of many community organizations, and on behalf of our project director, Venerable Karma Lekshe Somo, who's helped put all of this wonderful programs together. I'm pleased to welcome you all tonight. This is the first of a series of 3 evening presentations. Tomorrow evening, we are delighted that Professor Anne Klein will be speaking, and on Friday, Dr. Carl Becker. But this evening, we have to prepare us not only a scholar in Buddhist studies, somebody who has a doctorate in Theravada Buddhism, but also is familiar with Tibetan materials. Someone who has not only a doctorate, but has written a book called Love and Sympathy in Theravada Buddhism. He is, in addition to that, he's practicing what he preaches, not just like us scholars who talk. He's actually living this by being a psychotherapist. And really his major work in the last 20 years has been in the field of psychotherapy. He is a Master of Social Work from Boston University, and in Houston he has his private practice and works with families in crisis, with adolescent children as well, with those who are suffering from substance dependency, and a whole variety of crisis management areas. So here's someone who is taking Buddhism out of the textbook and really into personal practice. So I think his life and career embodies the 2 dimensions of this whole project, namely to bring the Buddhist culture together with the health services and the needs of the community. And so it's with a great deal of pleasure that I introduce to you Dr. HarveyAronson.
I'm just thrilled to pieces to be here and to get this no less. And do I say I got laid? What do I say? Couldn't resist. I'm really very, very happy to be here, and David created extremely minimal expectations by saying that apparently there are exams going on right now and that he thought virtually no one would appear. And we are all surprised and extremely happy to see somebody on this occasion. And I only hope that I could match David's wonderful introduction with what I have to offer. I certainly do all the things he says, aside from it's only 10 years that I've been doing psychotherapy rather than 20. But I take what he said seriously, and it's quite a benchmark that he set for me to live up to. But I appreciate the introduction, and I hope to say a little bit about why I'm here and what my interests are and what brings me to talk to you all about death and Buddhism. It's a very serious topic, and hope we can lighten it up a little bit as well. Buddhism starts with the finish, and I hope by the time that we've all spent our time together that that statement will make sense. Buddhism starts with the finish. And I think I might have to say something to all of you about how is it that I Texas, to talk to you about Buddhism and death. It certainly surprises me, and I sort of want to pinch myself and wake up from this dream. When I was a freshman in college, I was coming home from college and I got severe pains in my chest, and I thought for sure I was going to die. And in those days, doctors still made house calls, and this doctor came over to my house, and it was one of those bizarre situations where I thought I was going to be dying. I was having these heart pains. And he had narcolepsy, so every time he would say a couple of words and then he'd fall asleep, he'd ask me how I was and fall asleep. And, listen to my heart and he'd fall asleep. It was very scary. And I didn't really know what to do. What I really wanted to do most, though, was to keep my eyes open. And I don't know, part of that was my own fear of dying, my own desperate fear of dying, and perhaps just noticing how he was closing his eyes all the time. Luckily, it was nothing serious, and I went on to recuperate after a couple of days in the hospital. But that certainly got me in touch very, very personally with how scary for me death was, how personally threatening it was. And just put a sense of my own mortality right in front of my life. A few years later, I was a chemistry student at Brooklyn College, and I had done some reading in the scholarly journal called Playboy about LSD, and there was some talk about this psychologist named Richard Alpert and Timothy Leary doing some research out of Harvard on this strange drug that initially people were using to mimic psychotic episodes, and then the people who were doing the studies decided that it actually seemed to mimic religious experiences rather than psychotic episodes. And this man, Richard Alpert, was going to come to Brooklyn College and talk to the psychology club about his research. And being a curious guy and having found the article somewhat fascinating, I decided I would go. And it was a remarkable experience. At the tender age of 18, I was a sophomore in college. I was already pretty neurotic, extremely anxious, very, very nervous, subject to what I now know would be called obsessive rumination. And here was this psychology professor who was talking about ways in which, in his mind, LSD on the one hand, but Asian meditative traditions on the other, and cognitive psychology on the other, could all contribute to a sense of freedom, a sense of liberation. That in fact all of us probably had experiences of a sense of bondage and repetitiveness, that we get into ruts, that life is in a way just limited by these repetitive habitual patterns that we get into, but that there was a way out. And he was putting forward 3 ways out at that point. One was through his experiments with psychotropic chemicals. One was through meditation, and one was through his study of cognitive psychology. Richard Alpert at the time also talked about his experiences of universal love, which really touched me. And just in his talking about that, he was able to convey something of his own experiences to us in the audience. I was numb. It rarely, and for me it was once in a lifetime experience, where you go to a talk and the person sort of finally is saying something that you didn't exactly know you wanted to hear, but once you hear it, you knew this is what I wanted to hear my whole life. And he they talked about something that I'd wanted to hear about my whole life, namely some sense of freedom from bondage, freedom from struggle, freedom from a sense of constriction. I was quite a good chemistry student in those days, but having gone to that lecture and having heard what he had to say, I really felt that I just had to pursue more of this. I had to find out more about what was going on. And I could no longer justify to myself studying chemistry. I think I studied chemistry because my mother gave me a chemistry set actually when I was about 12. And I was so frustrated that I decided I had to go on big time and play with chemicals when I was an adult. And I was always sort of imagining what would it be that I would do as a chemistry person. And I was always leaning towards something that would help people and what would be the maximum way of doing chemistry to be helpful. But when I had gone to that lecture and heard what Alfred had to say, I just had this burning desire and need to find out more about what was it that could be offered to actually provide a sense of freedom, looseness, relaxation in one's life. And how could one cultivate something like this sense of universal love? So really my initial impetus and my initial drive was a sense of fear, with feelings of fear associated with fear of failure, fear of loss, and ultimately fear of death itself. And over the course of now almost 3 decades of exploration, I've certainly appreciated that Buddhism and Buddhist meditation addresses in direct and indirect means the whole question of death, fear of death, and questions associated with fear itself. As I studied more about Buddhism and eventually went on to graduate school in Buddhism and fairly academic study of Buddhism, I became acquainted with the story of Buddha's life. And over the years, I've had opportunities to ruminate about what that life story means to me, what it meant in the context of Asian history, Indian history. And I think that in some ways that our lives here in the modern world, my life in particular, had some and has some parallels with the life of Buddha. Many of you may be familiar with the life story, so please bear with me as I tell it. The young prince was born to a very, very wealthy family, a royal family, in the northeastern part of India, actually, in a part which is today Nepal. And a prophet was called, as was the custom in those days, to predict the young prince's future. The prophet foretold that this young prince, Gautama, would have one of two futures. He would either be a world ruler, or he would be a religious teacher with world stature. The father, being a typical father, sort of thought about it, I assume, and said to himself, religion, not much future. But politics, there's a profession. So he did everything in his power to keep his son in the royal line of things. And the father correctly reasoned that if his son should run across anything smacking of old age, sickness, or death, he might have some serious thoughts. And if he had serious thoughts, he might turn his mind to religion. So the father created an artificial environment, which I liken in my own mind to Disneyland, out of which all old age, sickness, and death were prohibited to appear. So this young prince, as the story goes, grows up in this completely artificial pleasure land in which nobody's growing old, nobody's sick, nobody's dying. So the inevitable happens. He's in his 20s, about and he gets curious. And he gets his charioteer to help him sneak out of the palace grounds and go out into the local neighborhood. And sure enough, when they're out there, in turn they see somebody who's old, and the young prince is shocked. What is this? What does this represent? Who is this? And the charioteer has to explain, this is an old person. All people grow old. This is our fate. Now, the whole thing has a mythic dimension to it insofar as it's hard to believe that one could really construct an environment where there are no old age, no people, sick people, no dead people. But there is a psychological truth to what's being said insofar as here is this young prince who's coming of age, he's in his 20s, and somehow he's beginning to grasp that all is not what it may seem to be when one is a young person. In our own culture, we have some sense, I think, certainly when we're in our teens, that we're invincible, nothing can touch us, and talk to a typical teenager, and certainly any thoughts of old age, sickness, and death, they can't comprehend what you're talking about. So, first there's an old person, then there's a sick person, and ultimately they see a corpse being moved for cremation. And the young prince says, what is this? And the charioteer says, this is a corpse, this is a dead person. We all are subject to death. And this is an extreme shock to the young prince. And he does not want to face the misery that he sees associated with growing old, growing sick, and dying. And he decides to leave home and pursue methods to become free from sufferings associated with old age, sickness, and death. Buddhism starts with the finish. After about 7 years of study and meditation, the prince experiences an enlightenment experience in an area of India called today Buddha Gaya, which just literally would be the name of the city in English would mean become Buddha. And Buddha, by the way, for those of you who don't know, means awakening. So the whole religion is a religion of awakening, insight, and enlightenment. The awakening of the young Prince Gautama that occurred in Buddha Gaya is described in the traditional texts. And it was made up of a couple of different parts. One part was that he had a massive vision that related to the idea that not only was there one birth, one growing old, and one old age and sickness and death, but that in fact life was repetitive, and that prior to whatever life we have today, there were prior lives that have brought us to this point. And that rebirth occurred not only amongst humans, but amongst various categories of existence over innumerable eons of time. In fact, in the traditions, it's usually described as beginningless, which is an idea that's very difficult to grasp, but in almost all of the Buddhist ancient traditions, the idea is that there is beginningless rebirth, and this stems from the Buddhist insights during the Enlightenment, that the quality of the individual's birth and life is influenced by actions that were done in prior lives. This is in brief, the teachings associated with laws of karma. That rebirth has a cause, which is attachment, and that attachment can be eradicated through a series of practices which are, in brief, enumerated as the Eightfold Path, which have to do with compassionate and ethical activity, concentration, and insight. That ultimately freedom can be had, freedom from bondage and liberation from bondage, liberation from powerless cyclic rebirth, through creating a behavior that's not harmful, stilling the mind, focusing the mind, and then understanding the way things are. In brief, settling, presence, and awareness lead to freedom. In general, the way we work is not one that is focused, settled, and aware. There are many interesting ways that I think that we today are quite different from probably the way people were 2,500 years ago in India. And on Saturday, when we're going to have the larger conference, I'll be saying more about that. But I think in some ways, things have stayed the same. And the part that stays the same is that back then as well, people's minds were probably running forward to the future and running back to the past, running forward with anticipation or fear, and back to the past with either reminiscence or regret. And if any of us are honest with ourselves, we know that as we spend our time, most of our time is spent running forward, could be planning, could be fearing, or reminiscing and regretting. And very few of us spend time in the present. We tend to have a sense of sort of flitting along the surface of life, almost like a stone being skipped on water. And what the practices that the Buddha taught have to teach us is a way of really, I call it, swelling the present. And that means instead of rushing forward to the future or rolling back to the past, there is a recognition that if we can slow the mind down and come into the present, that the present itself is extremely full in ways that are very different from the fullness that we typically seek through acquisition, grasping, wealth, relationships, ownership. Most of the way that we try to satisfy ourselves today, aggrandize ourselves and soothe ourselves, have to do with acquisition, ownership, taking things on, getting another degree, another car, another CD, another stereo, digital tape recorder, whatever it may be. I will feel better, fuller, if I own such and such a thing. And that type of restlessness of moving into the future, or acquisitiveness, ultimately doesn't cut it for any of us. And we all know that. We know that from our own experience. We know that from our colleagues and friends. We know it from the numerous examples of people who are rich and famous and who are utterly, utterly miserable. The spiritual truths that Buddha realized had to do with the understanding that there was a different type of wealth in the present. And the wealth of the present was the richness of being present without moving to the future, without moving to the past, and understanding things as they are. With that type of understanding and knowledge came a freedom from the powerless rebirth that until then he'd been experiencing. And he achieved a deep state of inner peace and calm that was so powerful for both himself and what it did to those who met him. The impetus of the energy of what he conveyed to others has been so powerful that it continues to impact us 2,500 years later. And I think in some ways you get some sense of the profundity of the realization by the profundity of the results. Moved by compassion and sympathy for others, The Buddha then spent the last 48 years of his life being enlightened at 32, teaching, and explicitly started the first missionary religion in the world, Buddhism, where he quite overtly and explicitly told the monks to go out into the world for the benefit of others, for the helpfulness of others, for the sake of being kind and merciful to others. I think there are some reasons that many of us find the message of Buddhism particularly attractive today. In some ways, we find ourselves in parallel circumstances to what Gautama found in his own life. Most of us don't live in farming communities anymore where life and death and the cycle of life and death with animals is particularly apparent. We don't even live in close-knit communities where friends and relatives and close ones are born, grow old, and die. If you look at the statistics for most of us will be moving every 2, 3, or 4 years of our lives in this country. In Houston, when I give a talk, typically I might ask people how many of you are natives, let's say, 50% of the people raise their hands. In some ways, we have created something of the same environment in the United States that Gautama's father created for him, a certain amount of sterility. We insulate ourselves from sick people by placing them all in hospitals. And most of us, I think, are probably like myself, when we go into a hospital, and if you don't work in a hospital, you're not used to going into a hospital, there's just sort of this freeze up that you feel on going in. And part of that has to do with the profundity of what's going on there. Part of it has to do with the mechanization of healthcare. But we don't really spend that much time around sick people. They really feel somehow, quote, different from us. Sickness is experienced as quite a threat, a challenge, and something very different. Old age is similar. Many of us don't have too much contact with older people. We isolate and segregate the older folks. We put them in old age homes. So that old age has become something that many of us don't see and don't experience. And finally, death, for the most part, occurs in hospitals or in old age homes. And many people will not experience the death of their loved ones. So the experiences of old age, sickness, and death are extremely strange to us and extremely shocking when they do occur. So there is some parallel between my own life experience when I got sick and had that shock and sort of crude or rude awakening, and what happened with Buddha when he became, as a prince, confronted with old age, sickness, and death. When I faced my own mortality, I certainly raised in my own mind the question, how do I want to die? If I have a choice, how will I die? Is there a better way to die than what I was doing then, which was being terrified and trying to keep my eyes open? What is a good death? And there are other sides to those questions as well. How does one live so that one dies well? How do I experience and engage with life so that I die well? And what meaning and purpose do I bring to my life so that I can live and die well? In 1964, I had that talk by Richard Alpert, and he really raised some options for me at that time for ways of beginning to answer some of these questions. And his talk really steered me in the direction, to begin with really, of Hinduism and Buddhism, but ultimately becoming extremely focused on Buddhism as a way of exploring what does it mean to die, what are the options for dying, what are the options for living, how does what I do with my life affect how I expect to die. Buddhist teachers over the years have realized that there is much power in contact with death. So much so that they've developed meditations to help meditators to focus their lives using death as a focus of meditation. Again, on Saturday, I'm going to talk a little bit more at length on how some of the Buddhist reflections on death differ from the way we might do it in general. I'm trying to entice you all to come. But in general, the meditation on death is not meant to generate depression or anxiety. And because of that, one doesn't necessarily, and I'm talking now mostly out of the Theravada Buddhist tradition, which is the Buddhism of Sri Lanka, Thailand, Burma, some parts of India, Vietnam, Laos. One doesn't necessarily think about one's own death, or even death of those who are close, near, and dear to one. The purpose of the meditation in these contexts, and I think this is in general most meditations on death in Buddhism, is to create a keen sense of energy and to create a sense of urgency about one's life in order to live well and die well. If we take something like this seriously and cultivate it habitually, at least for a while, there are certainly many, many moments in our lives when we run across triggers that can be used to sort of deepen this type of reflection. We all have, unfortunately, friends or relatives who do die. And if it's someone who's very close, obviously it's very, very shocking and can be very emotionally distressing. But it also can serve to be a wake-up call for how do I live from this point forward. We're all terminal. We all have a limited lifespan. We don't know how long we will live. And we all live an enormous amount of denial about our own deaths. Part of that may be necessary for mental health. If we really had an ongoing sensitivity to the imminence of our demise, for many it would be very, very difficult. It might be very, very difficult. But certainly, if one does meditation on death and begins to think about this, when one sees certain types of death on the TV or the radio, or hears about it on the radio, or when one has an acquaintance or friend who dies, one can certainly just pause and reflect on how does this now help me consider how I want to spend my life. And really, our lives are extremely precious, our life moments are extremely precious, and to the extent that we get sort of a wake-up call that life is short, what are you doing with it, how do you plan to live, how do you plan to die, it's a great blessing. And what the Buddhists have done in taking what all of us run across in our lives as a normal experience, they've institutionalized it by saying we can meditate on this and really sensitize ourselves in an ongoing way to the fact that we will die. I was lucky enough to spend much time with Tibetan teachers, and they have some very, very detailed meditations on death, and tomorrow Anne Klein will talk about some of those meditations. And one of the elements that's common to both Theravada Buddhism life. During the course of some teachings on death and the like, it became clear that I was allergic to yellow jackets, and had gotten into some fairly serious trouble one day at a Buddhist monastery in New Jersey, having stepped on it was this festival we were planning for, and I stepped on a yellow jacket nest and got stung by about 13 of them, and I didn't think anything of it, and then had hives all over my body, and my ears started feeling like stones, and they wheeled me over to the hospital. I had a very, very serious allergic reaction. I later learned that people really do die of this. But you think about how many nanograms or micrograms of yellow jacket toxin could kill a person if they're allergic. You know, like speck virtually, nanogram of this stuff could wipe you out. What does an AIDS virus weigh? The human body is extremely fragile in some ways, extremely fragile. And the causes and conditions that perpetuate us and support us are many, but the slightest things can go wrong, and we're goners. It can be a banana peel. You know, we've all heard sort of amazing horror stories of amazing ways that people have left this planet. So it can be very, very sobering and very, very energizing to realize that life is short. We don't know how long we've got. What will be the most profound thing that I can do with the time that I have? One of our teachers named Gonka used to sing wonderful chants. And one of the chants goes like this. Sabbe sankara anijati idapanyaya pasati atta nibindate dukke samago visudaya. And what that means is all conditioned phenomena are impermanent. When one sees that with wisdom, then one disintegrates suffering, and this is the path of purification. And really, it's sometimes joking around, when we would break dishes or something, we would just sing that to each other, because all things are in the process of disintegration, change, and impermanence. And in theory, if one really looks at it closely, our own minds, our own bodies are always in a process of disintegration. It's very helpful to think both on a macro level and ultimately in meditation, one gets down to a micro level of recognition that things are changing, growing, stabilizing, and then disintegrating on a moment-to-moment basis. Coming to observe and witness this with a spaciousness of mind ultimately allows one to become free. And what I'd like to do is, in some of the time left, we're going to have some time for discussion, is to lead everybody here through some very brief pieces of meditation so that you all can have some flavor of how meditation on death would be done. What I want to do in a very short way here is do a little bit of a preparation meditation, which is not necessarily typically Buddhist. I have found that for us, before we meditate, it's very helpful to sort of just do a little bit of relaxation. And I want to do a little bit of relaxation and then walk you through some of the elements of the Theravada meditation of death, and then do a little bit of mindfulness of the breathing. The point being that mindfulness of death creates a sense of urgency to come into the present, and the way one comes into the present is through concentration. And one of the simplest ways of doing it is concentration on the breathing. And then finally, I want to conclude it with the meditation on love, only insofar as it's a very nice meditation to do, and it's good for generating a kind and compassionate atmosphere between people. So are you all game for that? Then we'll have some discussion. Basically, in terms of posture and all of that, we could get very technical, but I'm not going to. You've all probably seen what statues of Buddha look like, and it's not so easy to do that. So since we're here in a Western-style auditorium, the key pieces are probably have your feet flat on the floor, with your hands maybe ideally comfortably on your lap. Typically, your right palm is on top of your left palm. Sometimes you'll see thumbs are open, sometimes you'll see the two thumbs are touching very gently. The other thing is, most important is that your back be straight but not tense. Your neck straight, again, but not tense. Your jaw a little bit down. Tongue to your palate. Mouth closed. And your eyes will be closed. They'll be looking about a yard down. If they were open, they would be looking about a yard down. And you want to try to do all this without a hell of a lot of strain, but just comfort. Okay, you all game to that? All right, so I'm going to sit down and then walk us all through a couple of meditations. First thing that I'm going to do is just do a little brief relaxation exercise to sort of get us out of our everyday mind and get us into the present a little bit more. So just start by focusing your attention on the top of your head. Focus your attention on the top of your head. And just allow yourselves to feel a sense of presence there, a sense of looseness. If you are noticing any major thoughts of the day or of the future or the past, see if you can allow those thoughts just to pass through your mind like leaves on a stream, gently, floating by, turning to bend and out of sight. If there are any real important leaves, they can float over into an alcove and wait for you there later. Just allow your attention to be at the top of your scalp, with a sense of loosening. Some people find it relaxing to imagine their scalp being massaged by dozens of little fingers, gently. And allow that sense of relaxation and calmness to flow down your forehead. It can be helpful to just say very gently internally, my forehead is loose and relaxed. My forehead is loose and relaxed. Allow that sense of relaxation. Move to one's temples. My temples are loose and relaxed. The area around my upper eyelids and lower eyelids is loose and relaxed. And yourselves to feel a sense of relaxation throughout your whole torso, down to your pelvis, the whole bottom area, upper legs, middle legs, and lower legs, down to my feet, loose and relaxed, my soul to loose and relaxed. Just allow a nice sense of relaxation to permeate the whole body. In this calm, relaxed state, just begin to pay some attention to the following issues. Reflect with some feeling that the human body is frail, subject to illness, allergies, viruses, bacteria, accidents, weather, climatic changes, old age. Any number of things can bring the body to its end. And having thought about maybe 1, 2, or 3 examples of how the body is frail and subject to various illnesses that easily bring it to death, just sit with the emotional conclusion for a few moments. The body is extremely frail. Following that, think about how the time of death is indefinite. We can all think of examples of explosions, hurricanes, volcanoes, tornadoes, typhoons, earthquakes, accidents, gunshots, explosions, where people die unexpectedly. I'm thinking of 1 or 2 or 3 examples of our own lives. We can come to the conclusion and just sit with the emotional conclusion. The time of death is indefinite. Following that, we can consider the whole sweep of human history. People of whatever race, culture, gender, religious belief system, whoever it is, we cannot come up with one person who has not died. So we can conclude that death is indeed definite. We can sit with the emotional conclusion. Death is indeed definite. In the face of recognizing the life and the body are frail, the time of death is indefinite, and that death itself is definite, we can develop a sense of urgency and understanding that what might be most useful and beneficial for us and others is for us to have balance of mind and understanding that allow us to be poised and balanced in the face of expectable changes and ultimate dissolution of our lives. And the way to accomplish this is through meditation. And the simplest entree into meditation is to meditate on the breath, at first using this meditation as a way of calming the mind. And the way we do this is simple. We observe the breath coming in at the nostrils, over the upper lip, and just try to stay with the experience of the breath hitting the upper lip or the nostrils. The breath coming in and the breath coming in, out. The sensations of the breath coming in and the breath coming out. If we can do that, let's just stay with that in the present as it occurs. There's some difficulty with that. We can use counting for helping us focus our minds. Counting 1 as we breathe in, 1 as we breathe out, 2 as we breathe in, 2 as we breathe out, 3 as we breathe in, 3 as we breathe out, up to 10. If our minds wander, just note it by a gentle internal mental observation, wandering, and bring the mind back to the breathing, to the number where you left off. Go back to 1 if you've forgotten where you left off. We'll do this for a few moments. on love that's based on the Theravada tradition. In this meditation, we start with ourselves, very gently and internally. Feel as follows. May I be free from suffering. May I be happy. May I be free from all abuse, internal and external. May my life be rich in meaning and centered in purpose. May I be blessed to see the challenge in my adversity. May I be at peace. In a large group like this, we can wish for each other, expanding our own minds to include people, the city, the state, and the country, ultimately the whole planet. The following wishes. You can just see if you can wish this along internally. May we all be free from suffering. May we all be happy. May we be free from all abuse, internal and external. May our lives be rich in meaning and centered in purpose. May we be blessed to see the challenge of our adversity. May we all be at peace. Traditionally, at the end of this meditation, there's the wish that all beings be happy. In Pali, the ancient language of Buddhism, it's chanted 3 times as follows. Sabbe sata sukhita hontu. Sabbe sata sukhita hontu. Sabbe sata sukhita hontu. May all beings be happy. May all beings be happy. May all beings be happy. Traditionally, one concludes activities that are virtuous with the thought, may all sentient beings be benefited completely by whatever merit we may have earned in engaging in these virtuous activities. And you're all ready, you can wiggle your toes and your fingers and open your eyes. We can now have some questions, if you like, or discussion. How was that for people? Any reaction? Yes.
What type of meditation was that?
It was basically a combination of a variety of Theravada Buddhist meditations. The relaxation is not exactly traditional, but I've just found that works. It's actually something called autogenic training, which is just a sort of a systematic relaxation. But everything else, the meditation on the death was out of the Theravada Buddhist tradition, mindfulness and breathing was, and so is the love meditation, although there are two passages in there that I've put in just for modern people, namely, may we all be, our lives be rich in meaning and centered in purpose, that's not traditional, and may we all be blessed to see the challenge of our adversity, that's not traditional.
I noticed that you when you started, you visualized from the top of your head. I'm familiar with Chinese meditation that you start at the feet, so it was interesting to start.
And that was not anything particularly traditional, that's just a way of relaxation. How was the experience for you?
It was good.
Really good. Anybody else? Questions after this? Yes? Right. So the question, for those of you who may not have heard that, is 86-year-old grandmother, and the student has heard that from various people teaching the class that death may be a beautiful experience, may intensify life, but here's an 86-year-old grandmother who never learned how to meditate. She's growing blind, did you say? And she's, can a person like this learn how to meditate? That's a great question. Without knowing the person specifically, it's hard to say. In theory, yes, I think anybody could learn, but without knowing how she is, she may be in some ways not prepared either mentally or emotionally to do it. It may be very difficult. I think that if it were very difficult, the other thing that people do in Buddhist cultures, which you can contemplate, is that there is a great deal of thought and attention paid to the end of one's days. There's this thought that one can die with a more balanced and virtuous mind. This is better than dying with an unbalanced and unvirtuous mind. So whatever can be done to allow her to be comfortable and to take some pleasure in the life that she's lived will probably be helpful from a Buddhist perspective. Whether she would actually be able to do something like meditation. The things that I did right here, if you wanted to try them with her, you'd be welcome to do that. Whether it be relaxation, just, relax. Just think to yourself, relax the various parts of your body. Begin with, can you observe your breathing, or can you focus on that? Can you wish yourself well? Just really simple things. I wouldn't be pushing things too hard, and especially if she's infirm in any way. I would just try to make her as comfortable as possible and allow her to feel as good as possible about her life. I think that would be very important. And to recognize that she's made a contribution. She's had you for your parents, and just the great things that she's done. And part of the earlier that one starts, the better off one is. That's just the hard truth. It's unfortunately true. Yeah, there was a question back there. So your question is, there's a lot of thought about the future in the next slide. Yeah, how much attention and how much thought should be put into past life karma? I think you're extremely right in that there is a lot of attention in many teachings towards the future. And in general, my experience with most Buddhist teachers is that not too much attention is paid to the past, only occasionally, you might run into a teacher and you might start talking about why is it that we're connected in some strange and profound way, and they may say something like, well, it's past karma. But I'll give you two answers, both in terms of the tradition. It's not my impression that the Buddhist traditions in general pay too much attention to trying to explore past karma. Buddha was said to have done it, and if you read the meditation manuals, with certain very, very highly developed stages of concentration, you can remember past lives, it's said. In general, it's discouraged because you can sort of get lost in that stuff. It's so fascinating. There are people, who do this today for psychological reasons and the like, and seem to sometimes have some interesting results with it. I personally haven't done that much. I keep my ears open, and some of it's pretty interesting, but I don't do too much of it either personally or professionally. But if it's something that seems to have some merit for somebody, then, I think that's fine. Yeah, over here.
First of all, I think you were very smart to put a call on loving and compassionate mood before we ask the questions. My question is there a specific Theravada experience of death? Or do you find that it is partly cultural, according to which country that Buddhism is in? I mean, I know we've been studying the Tibetan Buddhist experience of death, and there's specific experiences, specific bardo stages, and lights and different colors, and I just found it very specific, and I was wondering if you found it the same in Theravada Buddhism.
Okay, you're raising a really interesting question. The question for those of you who didn't hear it, are there specific Theravada Buddhist experiences of death? Because there's been much discussion of Tibetan Buddhist experiences of death, there's certain light experiences and certain bardos. I can't claim to be an expert on Theravada sociology of death, so I can't answer you directly, but I'll say this. There's some theory that I can say and something else. There are books and then there are experiences. And one of the interesting book things is that Theravada Buddhism does not have the same theoretical superstructure that Tibetan Buddhism does. So in Theravada Buddhism, there is no belief in the bardo per se. The idea in Theravada is that there's death consciousness followed by a rebirth consciousness, so that you would have the death consciousness of, let's say, if it's from human to human, which is sort of probably rare, you would have death consciousness as a human, and then there would be conception. Your consciousness would be joining a sperm and egg, and joining at that moment without a bardo. So their conceptualization of it is quite different. The other interesting question is, how do the various traditions describe that, and then what do the people actually experience? And I can't really speak as to what Theravada Buddhists experience vis-a-vis death. A lot of people in the West seem to have the near-death experiences seem to have some very specific characteristics. It's not totally clear to me that those are exactly parallel to some of the things that are described in the Tibetan tradition. So, and we don't necessarily have theoretical superstructure to support those near-death experiences. So I think you're asking an interesting question. It's not one that I can answer particularly profoundly, aside from saying that in theory, the Theravada Buddhists differ from the Tibetan Buddhists in not upholding the idea that there's a 49-day in-between state. that's a particular theoretical development that started in India but was not accepted by the Theravada Buddhists. There's a question over here somewhere, yeah.
I recently read Chopa's book on Peace, Body, Timeless Mind, and which he argues both logically and empirically that we don't necessarily have to die, that there is no real scientific evidence other than the fact that we all do, but that that it's pretty much a mass psychosis, so to speak. In any case, I was wondering what Buddhist traditions do in the face of information like that, which is pretty good for those that want the book, and in light of certain yogis that are known to exist in India that have been alive for hundreds of years.
Again, there's variance in the Buddhist traditions, and they're sort of critical and fascinating. Theravada Buddhism has Buddha attaining nirvana at his death. And what the nature of that nirvana is somewhat mysterious. But for the most part in the Theravada tradition, it's a non-manifest state, not one from which a Buddha returns, not one from which a Buddha is communicable. He's just attained nirvana, and it's so non-manifest that the early Theravada Buddhist art depicted Buddha not with the human body, but just with his footsteps or with absence, actually. And that was a very graphic representation of a parinirvana Buddha. The thought in Mahayana Buddhism, and that is then the Buddhism of parts of India early on, and then China, Tibet, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, was that the Buddha appears to die, but that in fact, once one is a Buddha, one can go on manifesting in whatever way is necessary for beings. So that there's a sort of an appearance of death, but not the Buddha continues because of his enlightenment and the power of his mind can manifest in whatever ways. And then in fact, all of space is filled with Buddhas, we just can't perceive them. So the Mahayana idea is actually probably in some ways closer to what Deepak Chopra is saying, but it's a little bit different. It's just that the human mind is capable of so much that once it is enlightened, it is in fact immortal. So there would be some resonance there. Yes, sir, there's a question.
My question is, in the Buddhist understanding that I have, one realizes that this is the life of suffering and sorrow. And I think the weight of it is on suffering and sorrow and not on the positive aspects of existence. And that though there are great moments of sorrow, there are great moments of joy. And I don't hear that addressed in Buddhism. I hear the weight on the escape. I've got to get out of this place of the pits. I'm leaving, and I'm going to do everything I can to not have to do this again. But I've had a great time so far.
You're lucky. There are a lot of different ways that could be addressed or answered. I don't think there's anything wrong with pleasure per se. I think that it is true that Buddhism does pay a lot of attention to suffering and sorrow. They would also say things like, in some ways, there are these interesting sort of psychological insights that you find in Buddhist texts. Even though they're very, very old, they sometimes are very, very apt. And sometimes they describe various world systems that we can be reborn in, or various life experiences that we can be reborn in. And one of those is the godly realm. And godly realm is basically a realm where one is always experiencing pleasure. It's very, very, very long. and it's just joy and bliss. And it's a great time, except the last 7 days, ungodly days, when the flowers that you've been wearing start fading and you start sweating for the first time. And at that point, from the heavenly realm, you realize it's about to change and you freak out. Because you just had like unalloyed pleasure for like billions of years. And for the first time, the reality is occurring that it's about to be over. So in some ways, life in modern times is like heaven. It really is. And we can maximize pleasure. And I think to the point that we can, suffering don't make much sense. And it's, but sometimes we run into those last 7 days, and that makes a lot of sense. But I wouldn't get into an argument with somebody if they're having a great time. Hey, enjoy it. If this doesn't make sense, it doesn't. The reality is it's going to come to an end. It just is. And how one relates to that, and how one interprets it, and how one wants to deal with that is where Buddhism either does make sense or doesn't. But certainly, many people can have a lot of pleasure, and the teachings of Buddhism may not make sense at that time. Anybody else? Yeah.
A little bit about how you apply your Buddhist experience to your lotus activities.
How do I apply my Buddhist experience to my psychotherapy practice? That's a great question. I think for a lot of it, I do it by way of what I've internalized from Buddhist practice in terms of I try to be fairly aware of what's going on within me, both in terms of my reactions, for example, to my clients, which technically may be called countertransference. And because of having done a lot of meditation, I may have some capacity for tolerating some knowledge of what's going on with me when I'm working with people. And I'm sort of aware if I'm anxious or angry or whatever, I may have some better sensitivity to that. I think that's helpful to have when we're working with people. I may have, because I've sat with a lot of my own craziness, have a little bit more patience with things than other people. And I have worked on a fair bit of compassion and love, so hopefully I try to bring some of that to my work with others. I don't typically explicitly preach or beat people over the head with Buddhist ideas. I'd like to work with people who are involved with spirituality, so typically what I have a pretty high tolerance for is if people come in and start talking to me about communication with other states of existence or other beings or whatever, I'm pretty tolerant of that and don't immediately call for a straitjacket or even medication. I just have a pretty wide acceptance of a wide variety of human experience. At the same time, I'm also very, very sensitive to the fact that people who get into spirituality sometimes bring a lot of denial into their spirituality. And I feel pretty free to poke around in people's spirituality to see if there isn't a healthy amount of pathology hanging out in their quote spirituality. And I think that's pretty important, because sometimes people are hiding from their shadow side, and hiding from their anger, and hiding from their sexuality. And they might use spirituality as sort of hideout for a lot of toxic stuff. And they work for a while, and then just sort of explode in their face. And usually by the time they've gotten to me, it's been exploding in their face. So that is, I can be very, very respectful of their spirituality, and I don't have to reduce their spirituality to psychopathology. I try to hold spirituality, but also explore where psychologically they may be getting into trouble. That's how I use it. I've also been doing more recently some work with meditation and creativity and life planning, but that's not necessarily so much therapeutic, but that's more like psychoeducational. Are you a therapist? Yeah. Do you have any ideas?
Yeah.
You want to share them?
Well, it's my own personal story, but I happen to speak Vietnamese, have a long personal life connection to Vietnam, which we were discussing in this room last night with one of the authors. And so I work with a lot of the Southeast Asian community,
Yeah.
and I just experiment with ways in which people can be taught to out of their tradition, whatever I understand of it, meditation and relaxation and just ways of viewing the world that are not standard, as you say, not to be diagnosed away and not really heard.
Yeah, I think if you're working with people who are explicitly Buddhist, and in Houston I don't have that much opportunity to do that, then your knowledge of the traditions, whatever extent you have that, would be very, very useful when appropriate. Sure.
Can I tell my favorite story about the Vietnamese man that went to a psychotherapist?
I can't stop you now.
I think this was in Florida somewhere. Some agency referred him to a psychotherapist, so he went and came back home, and his family said, well, what was the experience like? And he said, I'm certainly never going back to that. And they said, well, why? He said, not only do I have to pay the person, but I also have to do all the talking.
Right. And that speaks volumes right there.